My name is Claire, and I am 29 years old. For years, my parents reminded me that I was never enough, but I still hoped Christmas might be different. That night, the table was glowing with candles. Laughter from cousins filled the room. And for a moment, I let myself believe we could have peace. Then my father set down his knife. My mother folded her hands. And together they said, raising me was their biggest mistake. The room froze. My sister smirked. My aunt shook her head. And I felt every scar from childhood rip open at once. But what my parents did not know was that the one they tried to break held proof of a betrayal darker than anyone imagined. And if you stay with me until the end, you will see how that secret turned an entire family upside down. In that instant, I felt the air leave my lungs. And even surrounded by family, I had never felt more exposed. As if the ground itself was tilting beneath me. I still remember the glow of the Christmas tree lights, reflecting off the glass ornaments, the scent of roasted turkey and honey-glazed ham filling the dining room, and the sound of cousins laughing in the living room while holiday music played softly in the background. I had told myself all morning that this year would be different, that maybe for once my family would keep the peace and we could have something close to a normal Christmas dinner. At 29 years old, I should have known better. But hope is a stubborn thing. The long wooden table in my parents' house in Colorado Springs was covered with dishes. My mother Linda had arranged everything with her usual perfection. From the cranberry sauce in crystal bowls to the rolls stacked in a basket wrapped in a linen cloth. My father, Richard, carved the turkey at the head of the table, his expression serious as if he were conducting an important ceremony instead of a family meal. Around me, my relatives chatted about work, kids, and holiday plans. For a moment, I let myself relax, imagining that maybe this time we could sit through dinner without sharp words cutting through the air. I sat between my younger sister Emily and my Aunt Caroline. Emily looked flawless as always. Her long brown hair styled in soft waves. Her dress, a shade of red that suited her perfectly. She carried herself like the favorite child she had always been, smiling easily at everyone. Aunt Caroline, on my other side, leaned in now and then to whisper a kind word or ask if I needed more potatoes. Her presence the only comfort I felt at that table. Mark, my partner, had been invited but chose to spend the evening with his own parents. Something I did not argue with. Tonight was not the kind of night you drag someone into. As we passed plates and poured wine, the conversation turned to plans for the new year. My cousin talked about buying a new house. Someone else joked about needing to lose the holiday weight. I listened quietly, taking small bites, trying not to draw attention to myself. My mother always had a way of turning even the simplest remark into a criticism directed at me, and I was determined not to give her ammunition. The clinking of silverware and hum of voices lulled me into a false sense of safety. Then my father set down his carving knife with a deliberate motion. The sound of metal against the wooden board made several people glance up. He cleared his throat, and the chatter slowly faded until all eyes were on him. My mother folded her hands neatly in her lap. Her lips pressed into a thin line. I felt a tightness in my chest. The same instinctive dread I had felt since childhood, whenever both of them turned their attention toward me. Richard looked directly at me, his eyes cold and unreadable. Linda tilted her head as if preparing to support whatever he was about to say. I gripped my napkin under the table, already bracing myself. Then, in a calm, steady voice, my father said the words that sliced through the room like glass breaking. Raising you was our biggest mistake. For a split second, I thought I had misheard. The room seemed to hold its breath. The string of lights on the tree flickered, and the only sound was the crackle of the fireplace. My fork slipped from my fingers and landed on the plate with a sharp clink. My stomach twisted as if the floor had dropped out from beneath me. Every memory of being told I was not enough. Every cutting remark from my mother. Every disappointed glare from my father came rushing back at once. My mother did not flinch. Instead, she nodded slightly, as if confirming a fact long established. Her calm agreement was almost worse than the words themselves. My cheeks burned hot while the rest of me felt cold. Around the table, jaws dropped, eyes widened. A cousin let out a nervous laugh before realizing no one else found it funny. The weight of silence pressed down on me harder than the insult itself. Emily shifted beside me. When I turned my head, I caught the glimmer of satisfaction in her eyes. Her lips curled in the faintest smirk, quickly disguised as a sip of wine. But I had known her long enough to recognize it. She had thrived on my humiliation since we were kids. And tonight was no different. My throat tightened, but I forced myself not to give her the tears she wanted. On the other side, Aunt Caroline sat rigid in her chair. She shook her head slowly, disbelief etched on her face. She reached for my hand under the table and squeezed it. A quiet act of solidarity that nearly broke me. I held onto her hand like a lifeline, grounding myself in the storm that had just erupted. No one else spoke. Forks hovered above plates. Glasses remained untouched. The holiday warmth drained from the room, leaving only the harsh echo of my parents' condemnation. I looked at my father, at my mother, at the two people who should have loved me unconditionally. All I saw was judgment, disappointment, and something darker that I could not yet name. My pulse pounded in my ears, but my voice refused to come. For that moment, I could do nothing but sit there, trapped in the echo of their words, feeling as if time itself had stopped. The silence in that dining room dragged me back to a different night. One more than a decade ago, when I was only 17. It was the spring of 2012, and the sky had opened up with a downpour that rattled the windows of our small house in Colorado Springs. The rain was pounding so loudly against the glass that I could barely hear the television in the living room. That was the night my grandfather Samuel died, and everything I thought I could rely on began to unravel. Grandpa Samuel had been the only person who ever made me feel truly wanted. He owned a small auto repair shop near Pueblo, worked with his hands until arthritis slowed him down, and spent every Saturday morning making pancakes for me and Emily when we visited. He would pat my shoulder, call me his brightest star, and tell me that he was saving something special for me so I could go to college without worry. At 17, those words were a lifeline. When he passed, I clung to the hope that even in death, he had left me with a way out of the suffocating atmosphere of my own home. I still remember sitting on the stairs, listening to my parents in the kitchen arguing with hushed but urgent voices. I heard the scrape of a chair, my mother's sharp whisper, and my father's gruff tone. The only words I caught clearly were about money and documents. When I asked them later what Grandpa had left behind, they dismissed me without hesitation. My mother folded her arms and said that he had given everything to cover debts and medical expenses. My father snapped that Samuel had not left me a penny and that I should stop dreaming about handouts. I wanted to believe them, but something in my Aunt Caroline's eyes at the funeral told me there was more to the story. She hugged me tighter than usual, whispering to stay strong, but she never contradicted what my parents said out loud. As the months went by, I kept waiting for some letter, some confirmation. Anything. Nothing ever came. When senior year ended, the acceptance letter from the University of Colorado Boulder arrived. But without financial support, it felt like a cruel joke. My parents shrugged, reminding me that life was hard, and that Emily would probably find a way to make herself more deserving when her turn came. Emily was only 14 then, but she already had the soft admiration of my mother and the indulgent tolerance of my father. She played piano at family gatherings, wore neat dresses, and always seemed to say the right thing. Linda never missed a chance to remind me of the contrast. "Look at your sister," she would say, while Emily smiled sweetly. "She does what she is told. She is everything you are not." It did not matter that I was pulling straight A's or that I worked part-time at a diner to save money for school. It was never enough. Every good grade was brushed aside with a comment about how Emily would have done better. Every effort I made was repainted as selfish or insufficient. The weight of being the family disappointment pressed harder with every year, until I could barely stand to be in my own house. There was one night that sealed it for me, etched so deep in my memory that even now, at 29, I can still hear the exact sound of my father's voice. It was late. The rain lashing against the windows, thunder rumbling across the sky. I had asked him if he could at least help me with the cost of books for college. He had been drinking, the smell of bourbon clinging to his shirt, and his eyes narrowed as he leaned across the kitchen table. His words hit me like a fist. If it weren't for you, I would not be stuck in this life. If you had never been born, maybe things would have turned out better. The storm outside roared, but inside I went completely still. I felt something inside me fracture, a part of me that had believed maybe, just maybe, I could earn his love. After that night, I stopped asking for anything. I learned to make do with what little I had, to hide my tears and my hunger for affection. I took extra shifts at the diner, saved every dollar, and told myself I could climb out of this hole on my own. At school, teachers praised my work ethic. Friends envied my grades, but none of them knew the truth. None of them knew that I went home to a house where I was treated like an intruder. A reminder of everything my parents resented about their lives. Emily, meanwhile, was thriving. My mother beamed when she played piano at the church Christmas pageant. My father bragged about her grades, even when they were no better than mine. She was allowed to go on trips, to buy new clothes, to live a life that I was told we could not afford. Every privilege she enjoyed was another reminder of what I had been denied. I began to suspect that somewhere in the shadows of their finances, my parents had taken something that should have been mine, but without proof. All I had were suspicions and the gnawing ache of betrayal. Aunt Caroline remained the only person who seemed to notice. She would slip me $20 here and there, tell me I deserved better, and frown whenever my mother made cutting remarks at family dinners. But she never openly challenged Richard or Linda. The family line was clear. They spoke. Everyone else kept quiet, and I bore the burden of being the problem child. The memory of that rainy night in 2012 has never left me. Every time my father looked at me with disappointment, every time my mother sighed and muttered that I was difficult, I heard those words again. If it weren't for you. The echo followed me into adulthood, shaping the way I viewed myself, the way I flinched at kindness because it felt temporary, the way I worked twice as hard just to prove I was not a mistake. I carried that night with me through college, through every job I scraped together to stay afloat, and into every quiet moment when I wondered why my existence felt like a debt I could never repay. Sitting at the Christmas table in 2024, hearing them declare that raising me had been their biggest mistake, I felt that old fracture ache again. It was not new, only sharper, more public, and impossible to ignore. The storm from 12 years ago was still inside me, still raging, and it reminded me that the truth of what they had stolen from me had never been brought to light. That night in 2012 was not only about cruel words spoken in anger, it was about secrets buried with my grandfather, about a future stolen before I had the chance to claim it, about a girl who learned too young that love could be withheld as punishment. And as I sat frozen at that holiday table in 2024, my aunt's hand still gripping mine, I knew those buried secrets were not going to stay hidden forever. When I graduated from high school the following spring, the envelope from the University of Colorado Boulder arrived in the mail. My hands trembled as I opened it, half convinced it would be a rejection. But there it was. An acceptance letter, with my name in bold letters. For a few hours I let myself dream. I imagined living in Boulder, walking across campus with a backpack filled with books, finally stepping into the life my grandfather had told me I deserved. That dream cracked the moment I asked my parents about the money he had promised. My mother barely looked up from folding laundry when she reminded me that there was no money. My father snorted from his recliner, the television glow on his face, and told me that if I wanted college, I had better learn how to pay for it myself. I did. I picked up every shift I could at the diner where I had worked weekends, took a second job at a grocery store, bagging groceries, and later added hours as a teaching assistant once classes began. While other freshmen moved into dorms with new comforters and posters decorating their walls, I rented a cramped basement room in a family's house 30 minutes from campus. The air smelled of damp carpet, and the window barely let in sunlight. But it was what I could afford. Each morning I would take the bus before dawn, balancing textbooks on my lap as I tried to finish assignments between shifts. Those first semesters nearly broke me. I remember standing behind the counter at the diner with aching feet, pouring endless cups of coffee for truck drivers and office workers. I smiled because tips meant groceries. At the grocery store, I stacked milk cartons in the cold storage until my fingers went numb, telling myself that this was temporary, that somehow it would be worth it. In the library, I tutored freshmen who struggled with writing essays, pretending I was not exhausted myself. I lived on ramen noodles, peanut butter sandwiches, and whatever leftovers I could take home from work. When I called home to tell my parents how hard it was, my mother sighed and said it was character building. My father told me to stop whining, that Emily would never complain that way. I never forgot the moment my dreams of studying abroad shattered. I had applied to a program in London, convinced myself that maybe scholarships and loans would cover the cost. I even received an official invitation letter to join the fall semester abroad. I stared at that letter for hours, running my fingers over the embossed crest at the top of the page. I could picture myself walking along the Thames, attending lectures in centuries, old buildings, living the kind of life I had always imagined when Grandpa Samuel spoke of opportunities. But when I added up the numbers, the reality was brutal. Without the money he had promised, I was thousands of dollars short. Loans covered only so much. There was no one to co-sign for the rest. My parents refused even to discuss it. My mother's only comment was that traveling overseas was impractical and selfish. My father muttered that I should focus on surviving, not chasing fantasies. That night I folded the letter and tucked it into a box under my bed, my chest aching as if I had buried a part of myself. Meanwhile, Emily's life unfolded like a carefully planned play. She started high school in style, gifted a used car by our parents when she turned 16. While I scraped together bus fare, she drove to school with the windows down, her hair shining in the sun. That spring, while I was working 3 jobs just to stay afloat, my parents paid for Emily to join a trip with her friends to Florida. I watched her post photos from beaches with captions about freedom and fun. Each picture was like a reminder of what I had lost. My parents praised her constantly, telling relatives how proud they were, how bright her future looked. No one outside our house knew that I was living in a basement room and falling asleep over textbooks after midnight shifts. I tried to hide the resentment, but it gnawed at me. I sat in lecture halls, struggling to keep my eyes open, thinking of the opportunities slipping through my fingers. When classmates invited me out for pizza or drinks, I made excuses because every dollar mattered. I told myself over and over that I could endure this, that someday the sacrifice would pay off. But sometimes the weight was unbearable. I remember sitting in the campus library one evening, staring at the London acceptance letter I had pulled out again. My hands shook as I traced the words, knowing I could never go. I folded it carefully, pressed it back into the envelope, and whispered to myself that it was gone. It felt like morning. The worst part was knowing that my parents had chosen this for me. Maybe not directly, but by taking away what my grandfather left, they had cut off my chance at something better. They had forced me into years of exhaustion and sacrifice, then had the audacity to call me ungrateful whenever I faltered. The contrast between Emily's freedom and my struggle became unbearable. Each time she smiled at me with that mix of pity and superiority, I wanted to scream, but I stayed quiet. I worked harder. I carried the weight in silence because what else could I do? That silence followed me into adulthood. It shaped the way I handled every setback, every disappointment, every cruel word from my parents. It whispered that I was not enough, that I was foolish to want more. Yet even as I sat in that Christmas dining room years later, hearing them confirm aloud what they had always implied, I knew that letter in the box under my bed still existed. It was proof of the life they had stolen, the youth they had stripped from me. The pain of that missed opportunity lived in me like a scar. And as much as it hurt, it was also a reminder. One day, I promised myself, they would have to face what they had done. It was during one of those endless double shifts in Denver that I met Mark Stevens. I had been working at a small coffee shop near downtown to cover rent. wiping down tables with half-closed eyes, when a customer spilled his drink right across the counter. I rushed over with napkins and muttered an apology, only to find a man already helping. His calm voice steady and warm. He handed me a stack of napkins, smiled with a kind of patience I was not used to, and asked if I was all right. It startled me how much care could be in such a simple question. He started coming back. Sometimes in the morning on his way to work, sometimes in the evenings with a laptop open and a book on renewable energy tucked under his arm. I learned his name was Mark, that he was 32, and worked as an engineer for a firm that specialized in solar panel systems. What struck me most was the way he listened. I had grown used to conversations where my words were brushed aside or twisted into something small, but with him I felt as though every sentence mattered. He asked about my classes, my long hours, and instead of telling me I was wasting my time, he encouraged me. When I told him I wanted to work in marketing, he leaned forward and asked about the kind of projects that inspired me. His interest made me feel like I was allowed to dream again. Our friendship grew quickly, built on stolen moments between shifts and long talks over cups of coffee he insisted on paying for. One evening after I finished cleaning the machines, we walked outside into the crisp Denver air. He offered to drive me home since the buses were running late, and against my usual instincts to decline help, I accepted. In the car, he told me about his childhood in Fort Collins, about parents who had been supportive even when he stumbled, about how he wanted to dedicate his career to creating sustainable energy solutions. I sat there listening, both comforted and envious, realizing how different our upbringings had been. Yet instead of making me bitter, it made me feel hopeful, like maybe there were people in the world who could love without strings attached. For the first time in my life, I let my guard down. I told him pieces of my story, carefully at first, then more freely as the weeks passed. I confessed that I often felt like a burden, that my parents had made it clear I was never good enough. I expected him to back away, to see me as damaged, but he never did. He would look at me with steady eyes and say that none of it defined me. That kind of reassurance felt like oxygen in a room where I had been suffocating for years. As the months rolled on, our friendship turned into something deeper. Mark never pressured me, but one evening, when he reached for my hand across the small cafe table, I did not pull away. Being with him was like standing in sunlight after years of shadows. He celebrated my smallest victories, like finishing a marketing project or saving enough money to cover tuition without another loan. His laughter filled the spaces in me that had been hollow for too long. Eventually the day came when I introduced him to my parents. I dreaded it from the moment he asked if he could meet them. I tried to prepare him, warning that they were not the warm and welcoming type, but he brushed off my worries with a smile. He insisted that if we were serious, they should know him. I agreed, though a knot of fear twisted in my stomach. We drove to Colorado Springs on a Saturday evening, my palms sweaty on the steering wheel, as we pulled into the driveway of my parents' modest house. Inside, my mother Linda greeted us with a tight smile that did not reach her eyes. My father Richard sat in his recliner, the television muted, his gaze appraising Mark like he was inspecting a piece of equipment. We sat down to dinner, the air thick with unspoken judgment. Mark tried to keep the conversation light, talking about his work in renewable energy, about how he believed sustainable design could change communities. He spoke with quiet passion, but my father interrupted, his tone blunt and cutting. "How much do you make a year?" The words fell like a challenge, not a question. Mark shifted slightly, but answered honestly, explaining his salary and the projects he was working on. My father grunted, unimpressed, and reached for his beer. My mother set her fork down and looked directly at me, then at him. "My daughter has been a burden her whole life. Are you prepared to carry that?" The words stung worse than I could have imagined. My cheeks flushed hot, shame rising in me like a tide. I opened my mouth to defend myself, but before I could speak, Mark placed his hand gently on mine under the table. He met Linda's eyes with steady calm and said that he did not see me as a burden. He said I was the most determined person he knew, someone who worked harder than anyone, someone who deserved support. Not scorn. His voice did not waver. And in that moment I felt both humiliated and fiercely protected. The rest of the evening crawled by. My parents asked nothing about him beyond money and security. My father suggested that engineers were a dime a dozen and that real men worked with their hands. My mother rolled her eyes when I tried to share a story about a project I had completed at school. Emily popped into the kitchen once, all charm and brightness, and my parents lit up with pride at the sight of her. I shrank smaller in my chair, wishing I could vanish. By the time Mark and I finally left, my entire body felt tense with humiliation. In the car, I expected him to be silent, maybe even regretful for stepping into my world. Instead, he looked at me with sadness and said he finally understood why I doubted myself so often. He told me not to let their words define me, that their inability to see my worth did not mean it was not there. I stared out the window as tears blurred the passing streetlights, feeling both exposed and strangely relieved. For once, someone had seen the cruelty I lived with and had not turned away. That night I realized something. No matter how hard my parents tried to convince me that I was unworthy, Mark's steady belief in me was stronger. It was the first time in my life I felt loved without condition, without having to earn it. Sitting beside him on that drive back to Denver, I let myself believe that maybe I was not a mistake after all. A few months later, Aunt Caroline called and asked if I could come by her place in Pueblo to help her clean out the attic. She was planning to downsize and move closer to her daughter, and she needed an extra pair of hands. I agreed without hesitation. Spending time with her always felt different from being around the rest of my family. She spoke to me as if my words had value, and her quiet compassion had carried me through more than one dark season. Mark offered to drive me, but I told him I wanted to do this alone. I felt a pull I could not quite explain. The attic was hot and smelled of dust and cedar. Boxes were stacked to the ceiling, old furniture covered with sheets, and piles of magazines yellowed with age. We worked side by side, carrying cartons down the narrow stairs, sorting through clothes and keepsakes. After a few hours, I pushed aside a crate of holiday decorations and noticed a smaller box tucked behind it. The cardboard was soft from years of storage, the edges fraying. Written across the top in faded black marker were the words Samuel's papers. I froze. My grandfather's name leapt out at me as if it had been waiting. My heart began to hammer. I pulled the box into the light and sat cross-legged on the wooden floor. Caroline joined me, her brow furrowing as she read the label. She sighed and told me to go ahead and open it. Inside were envelopes, receipts, and notebooks filled with his handwriting. At the bottom was a folded stack of legal-sized paper. My fingers trembled as I pulled it free. It was a copy of his will. The ink was faint, the pages worn, but there it was, clear enough to read. My eyes darted to the section naming beneficiaries. My name was there, spelled out without question. He had left me his savings. The account that was supposed to fund my education, listed at around $75,000. He blinked. Rereading the lines, my throat tightening. After all those years of being told he had left nothing for me, here was proof that it had been mine all along. But then something caught my eye. Beside my name were faint handwritten notes, not in his tidy block letters, but in a slanted, uneven scrawl. Someone had scribbled adjustments in the margins, notes suggesting different allocations. One line had been crossed out and replaced. The signatures at the bottom looked strange too. I remembered my grandfather's handwriting, the way he formed his S, like a ribbon. This signature looked stiff, as if someone had tried to mimic it. My hands shook as I traced the ink. Caroline leaned closer, her face pale. She whispered that she had long suspected something was wrong. After the funeral, she had asked questions, but Richard and Linda shut her out quickly. They told her the estate was settled, that there was nothing left. She had always doubted their story, but without proof she could do nothing. Now, looking at the altered document in my lap, she pressed her lips together and shook her head. I knew your grandfather wanted you to have that money, she said softly. He told me many times he was saving it for your future. The attic seemed to close in around me. All those years of struggle, the nights of working until my body ached The dreams I had buried because I could not afford them suddenly made sense in a new and cruel way. It had not been fate or bad luck. It had been my parents' choice. They had taken what was meant for me and twisted it into something else. I felt my chest tighten, a mix of rage and grief rising in waves. My eyes blurred as I clutched the papers tighter, terrified they might vanish if I let go. I asked Caroline why she never pressed harder. She looked down at her hands and admitted she had feared being cut off from the family. She said she had no idea the will still existed in any form. I could see the guilt in her eyes, but I could not blame her. My parents had always controlled the narrative, and most of the family accepted it without question. For the first time, I saw how deeply their lies had spread, shaping everyone's understanding, including mine. I sat there for a long time staring at the faded ink. The pages trembled in my grip, the weight of them far heavier than paper should be. My breath came shallow, my body cold, despite the heat of the attic. Caroline reached for my arm and told me to be careful, that if what we were holding was true, it could mean trouble. I nodded. But inside me, something shifted. The quiet suspicion I had carried since I was 17 had just become something undeniable. This was not just neglect. This was betrayal written in ink. As I folded the will back into its envelope, I felt the ground beneath my life tilt. My parents had stolen more than money. They had stolen years of possibility, of freedom, of a future my grandfather had intended for me. And for the first time in my life, I felt the door to the truth creak open, as if the lies that bound me were beginning to unravel. After leaving Caroline's house, I could not stop replaying every memory of my parents after my grandfather's death. The contradictions that I once brushed aside came into sharp focus just weeks after his funeral. My father had driven home in a shiny new pickup, claiming he had gotten a good deal from a friend. My mother started buying designer handbags and bragging about weekend getaways. At the time, I told myself they must have tightened their belts elsewhere or found some unexpected windfall. But now I knew where that money had come from. It had been mine, stolen before I had even turned 18. I remembered overhearing them at a neighborhood barbecue, laughing with friends about their trip to Las Vegas. My father bragged about the buffet at a hotel on the Strip. My mother described the view from their suite. To everyone else, they painted a picture of hard-working parents who deserved a little fun after years of sacrifice. Later that same night, when the neighbors had gone home, my mother told me I was ungrateful for not appreciating how much they did for me. I had been standing in the kitchen washing dishes while she sipped wine, reminding me how expensive it was to raise a child who never seemed satisfied. The words had cut me then, but looking back now, they burned in a different way. The money they had squandered was supposed to be my education, my future. Determined to find proof, I went digging through old boxes in my parents' garage one weekend when I knew they would be out. The air was thick with dust and oil, the kind of smell that clung to my clothes. I sifted through piles of receipts, tax forms, and old bills until my fingers found a folder marked Nevada. My chest tightened as I opened it. Inside were credit card statements and hotel invoices from Las Vegas, dated within months of my grandfather's passing. Buried among them was a collection of gambling receipts, slips printed with the names of casinos I had only ever seen in commercials. One line showed a withdrawal that nearly matched the $75,000 listed in the will. I stared at the numbers until they blurred, my stomach twisting in disbelief and fury. Then, tucked between the pages, I found a photograph. My father had his arms slung around my mother's shoulders, both of them grinning, each holding a glass of champagne. Behind them stretched the glittering lights of the Las Vegas Strip. They looked carefree, victorious, as if they had conquered something. I pressed the photo between my shaking hands, bile rising in my throat. I could almost hear my mother's voice telling relatives that money was tight because of me, that I was the reason she could not live the life she deserved. All the while, she had been toasting under neon lights with the money my grandfather had trusted them to protect. The rage inside me was unlike anything I had ever felt. It was not just about the money, it was about the years of humiliation, the narrative they had spun to anyone who would listen, the way they had painted me as the weight dragging them down while they sipped cocktails in luxury hotels. They had convinced everyone, even me at times, that I was the problem. But the evidence in my hands told another story. I slipped the photograph and a few of the receipts into my bag, my pulse racing, as if I were the thief instead of them. That night, I showed the picture to Mark. We sat at his kitchen table, the light above us, casting shadows across the worn wood. He studied the photo quietly, then the receipts, and finally looked up at me with eyes full of sorrow and anger on my behalf. "This is proof," he said softly. "They stole from you, Claire. This is not just neglect. This is deliberate." I nodded, but my throat was too tight to answer. My hands were still trembling when he reached across the table and held them steady. For the first time in years, I felt like I was not carrying the truth alone. Over the next few days, I could not stop picturing that photograph, my parents, all smiles in Las Vegas, while I had been hunched over textbooks in a dim basement room, my body aching from double shifts. They had lived as though nothing had been taken, while I paid the price. The injustice of it consumed me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the champagne flutes raised in celebration, mocking the girl who had believed her parents when they said life was just harder for her than for others. I tucked the evidence away in a folder in my apartment, labeling it quietly in my mind as ammunition. I did not know when or how I would use it, but I knew one day I would. For now, I carried the weight of those papers like a secret fire, burning hotter each time my parents opened their mouths to criticize me. They thought they had buried the past, but I had unearthed it, and the day would come when they would no longer be able to hide behind lies. It took me weeks before I gathered the courage to take the folder to someone who could actually tell me what it meant. Mark had been urging me to speak with a lawyer, reminding me that my suspicions deserved confirmation. I finally made an appointment with an attorney in Denver named Rachel Coleman. She was around 40, sharp-eyed and direct, the kind of person who carried herself with quiet authority. Sitting in her office, I felt like a child again, clutching the folder in my lap, afraid that maybe I had been imagining things all along. Rachel spread the documents across her desk carefully, adjusting her glasses as she examined the faded copy of the will, the receipts, and the photograph. She took her time, scanning every line with the practiced patience of someone who had seen many families torn apart by inheritance disputes. I sat frozen in the chair, my palms sweating, waiting for her to say something that would either validate my anger or crush the fragile hope I had clung to. After several minutes, she looked up at me. "Claire," she said evenly, "this copy is messy, but it is absolutely consistent with a valid will. Your name is listed clearly as the beneficiary of your grandfather's savings account." She tapped the margin where the scribbled notes appeared. "And this handwriting is not the same as the original text. Whoever added these notes was trying to alter the distribution." Then she picked up the signature page, holding it closer to the light. "Do you see this?" She pointed to the awkward loops of the letters. "This is a forgery. Your grandfather's actual signature is on record. I can show you." My throat tightened. A forgery. The word made my skin crawl. Rachel rose and disappeared into another room. When she returned, she held a certified copy of the original will from the El Paso County Courthouse. The pages were crisp, stamped with an official seal. My name was there again, this time without edits or scribbles. The amount matched exactly what Grandpa Samuel had promised me. Rachel laid both documents side by side. The truth laid bare in black and white. My parents had not only lied, they had broken the law. I leaned forward, staring at the embossed seal until my vision blurred. Rachel's voice cut through my shock. "The account was liquidated just 3 weeks after your grandfather's death, withdrawn in full. The trail is very clear." She pushed the papers toward me and folded her hands. "If you choose to pursue this, your parents could face serious consequences. Forgery, fraud, misappropriation. These are criminal acts." My stomach churned as she spoke. Hearing the words aloud made it real, in a way it had never been before. For years I had blamed myself, wondering if I was foolish to believe I deserved more. Now the evidence was undeniable. They had stolen from me. I asked her what would happen if I brought this into the open. She explained that I could file a civil case to recover damages. Though after so many years it would be complicated, she also warned that a criminal case could still be pursued, depending on how aggressively the district attorney wanted to act. The idea of my parents standing in a courtroom, exposed for what they had done, sent a shiver through me. Part of me longed for it, and part of me recoiled. They were my parents, but they were also my betrayers. That tension tore at me as Rachel waited for my response. I told her I needed time. She nodded, sliding the certified copy back into a folder and handing it to me. Whatever you decide, you now have the truth. Do not let anyone take that from you again. Her words rang in my ears long after I left her office. I walked out onto the busy Denver street, the air sharp with winter cold, clutching the folder like it contained my entire life. In a way, it did. That evening, I sat with Mark at our small kitchen table, laying the documents out in front of him. He read them carefully, his jaw tightening as he traced the seal with his finger. "So this is it," he whispered. "Proof they forged it. Proof they stole it." I nodded, unable to speak. He reached for my hand. "You deserve justice, Claire. You deserve to be free of their lies." His certainty steadied me, but my mind swirled with questions. What would happen to the family if this came out? How would Emily react? Would Aunt Caroline finally know she had been right all along? I folded the papers carefully and placed them back in the folder. My heart pounded as if the decision to act were already looming over me. The truth was no longer a suspicion or a secret I carried alone. It was stamped, sealed, and undeniable, and no matter how much fear twisted inside me, I knew that one day soon I would have to decide what to do with it. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest I had ever faced. By day, I pushed myself through long hours at a tech company in Denver, where I worked in the marketing department, juggling deadlines and endless presentations. By night, I lay awake replaying the lawyer's words, staring at the folder on my nightstand as if it might burst into flames. My body was running on caffeine and nerves, my spirit caught between rage and exhaustion. One Tuesday morning, after a string of 14-hour days, I felt the room tilt while I was standing in a conference meeting. The voices around me blurred. The slides on the screen swam before my eyes. And then everything went black. When I opened them again, I was lying on the floor, with my co-workers gathered in a circle above me, their faces filled with shock. Someone called my name, but I could not answer. An ambulance came, and my colleague Rebecca rode with me to the hospital. She held my hand as the paramedics asked questions, her eyes wide with worry. Rebecca was a few years older than me, sharp and kind, the kind of person who always noticed when someone was struggling. At the hospital, they said it was exhaustion, dehydration, and stress. They told me to rest, to slow down. But how do you slow down when your whole life has been about surviving? When we left the hospital, Rebecca insisted on driving me home. I sat, slumped against the seat, my body aching in ways I had ignored for too long. She broke the silence with a question that cut sharper than any accusation. "Claire, why is it that your sister gets to live so comfortably while you are working yourself into the ground?" I stared out the window, the city lights flashing by like streaks of accusation. My throat tightened, words forming and dying before they reached my lips. Rebecca knew pieces of my story, but I had never told her the whole truth. Not about the stolen inheritance, not about the nights of humiliation at my parents' table, not about the weight I carried that was never mine to bear. Her question echoed in my head long after she dropped me off. I sat in my apartment staring at the walls, at the neat folder sitting on my desk, at the evidence of everything that had been taken from me. I thought about Emily posting pictures from beaches in Florida, laughing behind the wheel of her car, living in the ease my parents had gifted her. And then I thought about the years I had lost, the dreams I had buried because I was told there was nothing for me. The anger built in me like a rising tide. I had collapsed in my workplace because of the weight of lies I had been carrying. My body had given out before my will did, and that simple truth terrified me. I realized that if I did not act, if I did not find a way to confront this, I would spend the rest of my life letting them rob me of more than money. They would rob me of my health, my future, my very sense of self. Mark sat with me that night, holding me as I cried into his shoulder. I told him about Rebecca's question, about how it had pierced through all my defenses. He listened quietly, his arms strong around me, his silence more comforting than any words. When I finally pulled away, he looked me in the eye and said that Rebecca was right. My life had been stolen piece by piece, and unless I decided to stop it, the theft would never end. The next morning I woke up with a different kind of determination. My body was still weak, but something inside me had hardened. I opened the folder again, ran my fingers over the embossed seal of the certified will, and stared at my name printed there in bold ink. That was my grandfather's love, his final gift, and it had been twisted into fuel for my parents' lies. For years I had carried shame as if it belonged to me. But sitting there in the quiet of my apartment, I felt it shift. The shame was never mine. It belonged to them. They had dressed it in words and handed it to me, but I no longer had to keep it. Rebecca's voice echoed in my mind, sharp and true. Why is it your sister gets everything while you collapse? I realized I had no answer that justified staying silent any longer. The only answer was that it was time to stop letting them bury me. I folded the papers back into the folder and placed it carefully in my bag. The decision had not been fully made, but the path was clear. My parents had built their lives on lies, and I was done living beneath them. For the first time, the idea of exposing the truth did not feel like a terrifying possibility. It felt like survival. Not long after my collapse at work, whispers began to move through the church community where my parents had always paraded their reputation as hard-working, self-sacrificing pillars of faith. Pastor John had been a steady figure in our congregation for as long as I could remember. A man who often closed services with reminders about honesty and family. One Sunday afternoon, Caroline pulled me aside after service and told me that Pastor John had asked her some pointed questions. He had heard from another parishioner that there might have been issues with Grandpa Samuel's estate. The news jolted me. I had not spoken openly to anyone but Mark and the attorney. But gossip has a way of slipping through cracks you do not see. Maybe it was the strange timing of my fainting spell, or the hushed conversations Caroline and I had shared. Or maybe someone had caught sight of the papers when I carried them. However it started, the rumors had found soil and taken root. Within a week, neighbors were exchanging knowing glances at the grocery store, and one even asked if it was true that I had been cheated out of something left for me. I kept my answers vague, but inside I felt both fear and relief. Fear that my parents would come down harder than ever, but relief that the truth was no longer just mine to carry. The call came late one evening while I was preparing notes for a client presentation. The moment I saw my father's name flash across the screen, my stomach clenched. I answered, and his voice came through, hard and angry. "Are you spreading lies about us?" His tone was like gravel grinding against metal. He demanded to know if I had been talking to people at church, if I had been poisoning the family's reputation with stories about money that never existed. I tried to steady my breathing before answering. "Dad," I said quietly, "I have not lied about anything." His sharp laugh cut me off. "Do you think you can destroy us with your bitterness? You were always looking for someone to blame for your failures. If you keep pushing this, you will regret it." Before I could respond, my mother's voice joined the line, trembling with rehearsed emotion. "Claire, how could you? After everything we sacrificed for you, after all the years we worked ourselves to the bone." She began to cry. The kind of crying I had grown up with. Heavy with accusation rather than pain. "You are so ungrateful. You have no idea what we went through to raise you." I closed my eyes, pressing my palm against my forehead. Their performance was almost impressive. A mixture of rage and self-pity that could have convinced anyone who had not seen the evidence. But I had. I had the will, the receipts, the photograph of them celebrating in Las Vegas. I let the silence hang until my father barked at me again. "Well, are you going to deny it?" My voice came out calmer than I expected. "The truth does not need me to invent it. Soon enough, everyone will see it for what it is." The line went so quiet, I thought they had hung up. Then my father swore under his breath, and the call disconnected. I stared at the phone in my hand, my pulse racing, but my body strangely steady. For the first time, I had spoken without bending, without apologizing. It felt like standing on solid ground after years of sinking sand. The next day, Caroline called. Her voice hushed. She told me that people in town were buzzing. Pastor John had mentioned in a prayer circle that dishonesty corrodes even the strongest families. No names were spoken, but everyone understood. Some of my parents' closest friends had started to avoid them. One woman had even refused Linda's offer to host the next women's fellowship, saying she was busy. Small cracks, but cracks nonetheless. I knew the storm was only beginning. My parents had built their lives on a careful image, telling everyone they had suffered under the weight of raising a difficult daughter. Now that mask was slipping. I could picture my father pacing the living room, clenching his fists. My mother rehearsing lines to defend herself to anyone who asked. They had always believed they controlled the story. But now the story was slipping beyond their grasp. That night, as I lay in bed, I realized that my quiet resistance had shifted into something louder, something public. The whispers were not mine to start, but I would not stop them either. Let the truth echo. Let it spread. My parents had wanted me to carry their lies forever, but I was done carrying anything that was not mine. The air in the dining room felt thick, as though the garland and lights strung around the windows were pressing down instead of brightening the night. I could hear the faint buzz of the string lights on the Christmas tree, each bulb flickering like it was trying to hold its breath along with the rest of us. My father's words had landed like a hammer. My mother's nod had driven the nail deeper. And the silence that followed was suffocating. My pulse hammered in my ears. But instead of shrinking back, I pushed back my chair and rose to my feet. The scrape of wood against the floor drew every eye to me. My hands trembled. Not with fear, but with something close to release. For 29 years, I had let them own the story. Let them write me as the mistake. Tonight, under the glow of the Christmas tree, I would take the story back. I bent down and pulled my leather bag from under the chair. The zipper echoed far louder than it should have, slicing through the silence. I set the folder on the table in front of my plate. My mother's face twitched. My father's jaw locked. But I no longer cared. My fingers slid the papers free, smoothing them on the tablecloth. The weight of them was heavy but steady. The way truth always is. I lifted the first page so the light caught the embossed seal. Grandpa Samuel left his savings to me, I said, my voice calm but carrying across the table. Not to my parents. Not to anyone else. To me. $75,000. A wave of murmurs rippled through the room. My cousin Derek leaned forward, his brow furrowing as he squinted at the page. Aunt Caroline's lips parted as though she already knew what she would see, but could hardly believe it was there. Emily's fork clattered against her plate, her shoulders stiff. I set the certified copy of the will down, in the middle of the table where the candlelight flickered against the seal. This is not just my word. It is recorded at the El Paso County Courthouse. His wishes were clear. He wanted me to have a chance at a future. My father shifted in his chair, his face darkening. But before he could speak, I laid out the receipts. Hotel bills from Las Vegas. Casino withdrawals. All dated within 3 weeks of his funeral. And then, the photograph. I placed it on the table like the final card, in a hand that had been hidden too long. The image silenced the last of the whispers. My parents, smiling under the neon lights of the strip. Champagne glasses raised high. My mother in a sequined dress. My father's arm looped around her shoulders. They looked carefree, triumphant, as though celebrating their freedom. My chest tightened. That was the freedom they bought with my future. Emily's face crumpled. Her mascara streaked as tears spilled down her cheeks. You told us there was nothing. You told me he left us debts. She looked from my mother to my father, her voice breaking. How could you? Aunt Caroline pressed her hands together, her eyes glistening. I knew something was wrong, she whispered, her voice trembling. I knew Samuel wanted Claire to have that money. He told me himself more than once. She looked at me with a mixture of sorrow and vindication, her voice steadier the second time. I should have spoken louder back then. The rest of the family sat frozen. My Uncle Robert's mouth hung open. My cousin's wife clutched her napkin in silence. Even the children, usually restless and noisy, stared with wide eyes, sensing the gravity even if they did not understand the words. The dining room, once filled with the clatter of forks and the scent of roasted ham, now felt like a courtroom. I turned back to my parents. For years you told everyone you sacrificed for me, that raising me ruined your lives. But here is the truth. You stole from me. You stole from your own daughter. My father finally slammed his hand against the table, rattling the silverware. Enough, he barked, his voice cracking under the weight of fury. You don't know what you're talking about. Those papers mean nothing. His eyes darted to the will, then to the receipts, then away again as if he could will them out of existence. My mother tried a different tactic, her tears flowing, her voice pitched high. Claire, please. You don't understand. We had to survive. We did what we had to do. She looked around the table, appealing to the relatives who were now staring at her with suspicion. We kept food on the table. We kept a roof over her head. I shook my head slowly. You kept your lies alive. You let me believe I was a burden while you drank champagne with the money meant for my education. You watched me work myself to exhaustion, collapsing under the weight you put on me, while you pretended there was nothing left. Emily sobbed harder, her shoulders shaking. For once, the smugness she always carried was gone. She looked smaller, like a child seeing her parents clearly for the first time. She whispered through tears, I can't believe this. Caroline's voice cut through again, stronger this time. I believe it. I suspected it all along, and now there is no hiding it. My mother buried her face in her hands, but no one reached across the table to comfort her. My father leaned back, his jaw tight, but his silence spoke louder than any denial. The evidence was laid bare. Undeniable. I gathered the papers slowly, sliding them back into the folder with careful hands. My chest rose and fell with steady breaths. The weight I had carried alone for years now sat squarely on the table for everyone to see. There was no taking it back, no rewinding the clock. The room was different now, forever changed. The clinking of the grandfather clock in the corner filled the silence, each tick marking the end of an old story and the beginning of something new. I remained standing, my hands resting on the folder, my family's wide eyes fixed on me. For the first time in my life, I did not feel small. I felt tall, steady, and unbroken. Even in the wreckage of what I had just revealed, the first sound after my words settled was the scrape of a chair. Uncle Robert stood, his face pale but his voice firm. I believe her. He looked down the table at my father and mother, his expression heavy with disappointment. You lied to all of us. Aunt Caroline nodded, tears still shining in her eyes, and others began to murmur their agreement. The shift was undeniable. For years my parents had held the power in every room, but now the tide had turned. Pastor John, who had been invited as a guest and sat at the far end of the table, cleared his throat. His presence had been quiet, until now, but his words carried authority. I cannot stay silent when dishonesty of this magnitude is revealed. The truth will not remain hidden. Not in this community. He spoke with the conviction of a man who had guided many families, and I saw my parents flinch. They knew what it meant for him to speak out. Richard's face turned crimson, his voice sharp and defensive. This is family business. You all have no right to interfere. But the words fell flat. No one moved to defend him. No one softened Linda's sobs as she tried to cry her way into sympathy. The days that followed moved faster than I could have imagined. By the next Sunday, word had spread throughout our church. Pastor John did not name my parents outright, but his sermon was a clear rebuke. A parable about betrayal and stolen legacies. Congregants whispered in pews, and by the time service ended, everyone seemed to know. Richard and Linda, once praised as stalwart members, found themselves shunned. Handshakes that had once been eager were withheld, invitations rescinded. I heard from Caroline that neighbors had begun avoiding them. Friends who used to gather at their house for barbecues stopped calling. One of my mother's closest companions told her outright that she wanted nothing to do with liars. The isolation came swiftly. And each report brought me a strange mix of sadness and justice. It was Linda who broke first. She came to my apartment uninvited one evening. Her face streaked with tears. Her voice raw. "Claire, please. We are still your parents. We can put this behind us. Do not make this worse than it already is." I stood in the doorway, the cold night air rushing in around her, and felt the weight of her words like a practice script. For years those pleas would have pulled me back into silence. But not now. I kept my voice steady. Family does not steal from their child. Family does not bury the truth for 12 years while letting her collapse under the weight of lies. If you wanted to be my family, you should have acted like it. Her shoulders slumped, and for the first time I saw not anger or manipulation, but defeat. She whispered that she never thought it would come to this, that she only wanted to survive. I shook my head, closing the door gently but firmly, leaving her on the porch with her tears. Richard never came. His pride was too thick, his fury too sharp. But I heard from cousins that he raged about betrayal, convinced that I had turned everyone against him. The truth was, he had done it himself. Each lie, each sneer, each selfish choice had built the walls now closing in on him. Christmas lights still glowed in the windows of their house when I drove past later that week. But the driveway was empty. No guests arriving. No laughter spilling out onto the street. The home that had once been their stage was now a hollow shell. At the next family gathering, hosted by Robert and his wife in January, the divide was complete. Everyone welcomed me with open arms, asking how I was holding up, praising my courage for speaking out. My parents were not there. Their absence was heavy, but no one rushed to fill it with excuses. Caroline raised her glass and said quietly to the room that truth had a way of surviving, even the deepest lies. Not of pain, but of release. That night, as I left the dinner, Linda's words echoed faintly in my memory. "We are still your family." But when I opened the door to the winter air, stepping out into the quiet street, I knew the truth more clearly than ever. Family is not defined by blood or by obligation. Family is defined by love, trust, and truth. And by those measures, I had never truly belonged to Richard and Linda. I closed my coat tighter around me and walked toward my car, leaving behind the ruin they had created, their reputations collapsing in the silence of their own house. For the first time in years, I felt the burden lift as the night wrapped around me. 2 years later, the snow fell softly outside our Denver home, blanketing the streets in quiet white. Inside the living room, the sound of laughter echoed as my daughter Emma toddled across the rug, her curls bouncing, her giggles filling every corner. Mark sat on the couch, arms open, catching her as she stumbled into his chest. Watching them together, my heart swelled with a kind of peace I never thought I would know. Our house was small but warm, filled with the kind of love that made every space glow. The walls were decorated with Emma's drawings and photographs of the three of us, snapshots of moments we chose to treasure. On the bookshelf rested a frame that held a picture of Grandpa Samuel, the only person in my childhood who had truly believed in me. Sometimes when Emma asked about him, I told her stories about how much he had loved me and how his dream had been for me to have a future free of burdens. Life had not magically become easy, but it had become ours. Mark and I worked hard, building not just careers but a family rooted in kindness and truth. There were days of exhaustion, sleepless nights, and the constant juggling of responsibilities, but underneath it all ran a steady current of love that never wavered. I had sworn that the cycle would end with me, and every day with Emma proved that I was keeping that promise. There were still whispers in the community about my parents. Their names came up less and less, as if they had faded into the background of a story everyone had grown tired of repeating. Pastor John told me once that Richard and Linda rarely attended church anymore. When they did, They sat alone in the back, ignored by people who once clung to their every word. Invitations stopped arriving at their door. Old friends no longer returned their calls. What they had feared most, social isolation, had become their daily reality. I heard through Caroline that they might even face legal consequences. The attorney I had spoken with had kept the file open. And though I never pressed charges, others in the family were discussing it. The forged signatures, the false filings, the evidence was undeniable. Whether or not the law came for them, the judgment of truth already had. Sometimes late at night I wondered if they regretted it, if they sat in their quiet house and replayed the moment I laid the papers on the Christmas table, the moment the lies collapsed. I would never know. They never reached out again after that evening on my porch. Even if they had, I could not have opened the door. Too many years had been lost. Too much damage done. Instead, I poured my energy into the life in front of me. I watched Emma grow. Her world filled with joy, discovery, and unconditional love. She would never hear words that made her question her worth. She would never carry the weight of being called a mistake. When she stumbled, I lifted her. When she laughed, I laughed with her. When she dreamed, I told her she was capable. The contrast was striking. My parents had stolen my youth, but in raising Emma with Mark, I was reclaiming it. Each bedtime story, each shared meal, each morning kiss on her forehead was a small act of rebellion against the cruelty that raised me. The cycle was broken. One evening, as we decorated our Christmas tree, Emma reached for the star topper with both hands, her face alight with wonder. Mark lifted her onto his shoulders so she could place it at the very top. I stood back, watching, tears stinging my eyes. This was what family was meant to feel like. Not pain, not betrayal, but belonging. I no longer needed revenge. The truth had been enough. The lies had consumed themselves, leaving my parents in a cage of their own making. Karma had done the rest. What I needed, what I had always longed for, was peace, and I had found it. Now, as I sit here telling this story, I think of all the people who carry secrets, who endure cruelty behind closed doors, who wonder if they will ever be free. Sometimes the only way forward is to drag the truth into the light, no matter how painful, because only then can you step out of the shadow. That night, in 2024, when I laid the will and the receipts on the table, I thought I was exposing them. What I was really doing was freeing myself. I left behind the burden of their lies and stepped into the life I was always meant to live. And looking at Emma's smile, I know I will never let her carry what I carried. The chain ends here. If you have ever stood at a table where family made you feel small, if you have ever had to choose between silence and survival, I hope my story reminds you that you are not alone. Share your experiences in the comments, because your truth matters too. And if this story spoke to you, remember to like this video and subscribe to hear more real stories of resilience, justice, and the strength it takes to end toxic cycles, because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is speak the truth, and sometimes the most powerful gift you can give is freedom, both to yourself and to the generations that come after you.